This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Maris, and I'm here with my co-host James Majewski. Hey James.
Hey Thomas.
And we're going to be joined in our discussion by our frequent guest co-host, Canadian filmmaker and writer Nathan Douglas. Welcome, Nathan.
Hey guys. Thanks as always for having me back. It's really exciting to discuss this film.
James, congratulations on the birth of your second son.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Cormac Elijah was born on May 17th, and it's been a blast. I've also been tremendously sick the past few days, so it was like there was just no letting up. We were in the middle of our big spring fundraising campaign, and then my child was born, and then the campaign was coming to an end, and then I got like devastatingly sick. So here we are recording, and I'm still on the mend, but I've donned my white garment to give the impression of health, so that for our viewers' viewing pleasure.
Well, this is our first podcast since the end of the Easter campaign. So, want to tell people how that went?
Yeah, it went really well. So we reached our goal. $60,000 was raised. It's the largest amount that we've raised during a spring campaign to date. And that also means we won our $60,000 matching grant. So it's a really big boon for Catholic culture. We've been undergoing several years of increasing costs just because of staff expansion and just trying to grow the website. So we're kind of nearing the end of that, and it's nice to see that so far so good. Thanks be to God. Thank you to all of our donors. Thanks to anybody, especially who may be listening to this podcast or checking us out on YouTube. We really appreciate your support. You know, it's one thing to get support from those who are already sort of in the network of CatholicCulture.org and have already been longtime supporters, but it's another thing to be drawing support from new audiences, you know, whether on the podcast medium or now on YouTube, which is very much sort of a new enterprise for Catholic culture.
Yes, thank you very much to all of our donors, especially if any of our Criteria listeners contributed. We're really grateful. And to today's film, one of the big religious canonical masterpieces of religious cinema of all time, on the Vatican film list in the category of religion, Carl Theodor Dreyer's, I don't know if it's Theodor or Theodore actually, Dreyer's Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928. This film was made a mere 8 years after the canonization of Joan of Arc. Sometimes you forget. Wow. Some of these iconic saints were not canonized, like Thomas More, for instance, until the 20th century. It's based largely on historical transcripts of her trial, and a number of things have secured its reputation. Probably most of all, its performance by the great actress Renee Falconetti, she was the 35-year-old actress playing the 19-year-old Joan of Arc. It is definitely the most iconic performance by an actor in a silent film, and some would say in any film in the whole history of cinema. And then also it's known for its radical visual style. Its extensive use of close-ups, for instance, and various other aspects that we can talk about. This is one of the top, 3 or 4 on most people's lists of great religious films, along with, a film like Andrei Rublev, which we already discussed. So we're excited to talk about the film. But first, here's a clip from The Passion of Joan of Arc. of all the silent films we've watched so far, and probably of all the silent films I've seen in general, I think that this film feels least dated. Would you agree with that?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that this film feels like very relevant, very fresh. I it's one of those movies that you watch and you feel like film is dead. Like we stopped making good movies a long time ago.
Right.
And that's like overstating the case, but every once in a while I'm watching a film and I'm just like, yeah, we've probably exhausted everything that this medium can produce, and it's all downhill from here. No offense, Nathan. But
still gotta try,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're talking about it's sort of like it's deeper qualities, but I was more talking about like the production itself feels less dated. Like visually, it feels less dated.
I was definitely talking about the production also. Yeah,
okay,
I mean everything. Cool. It's like snappy and dramatic and visually arresting and intense. It's I think that there's a lot here that, especially for someone who's maybe not used to watching silent films, as an introductory silent film, I think that this is a great hook.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, especially because there's several versions of it out there. So on the Criterion collection, on the Criterion channel, rather, I think there's 3 different versions. With a few different scores, and one of the scores is like a kind of electronic arrangement. That was the first one that I watched. And that one definitely gives it a more sort of modern feel, because the score is very moody, very evocative, and sort of accentuates the rhythm, the quick sort of dramatic pacing of the piece. And I think that where other silent films maybe can give the impression of sort of being like like a single note, or kind of dragging, and not to say that they do, but I think that for a modern audience that's not sort of developed the palate for a silent film, that might be the taste that's left in their mouth. This, I think, accomplishes a very different thing. I think that watching this, whether you're a fan of silent films or not, you'll really get a sense of the ups and downs and the mountains and the valleys of this story. That's really quite gripping. It's a long film. It's a solid, how it's like an hour 20 minutes, an hour and a half. You
mean long for like somebody who's unused to viewing silent films?
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are longer films, but I mean that it feels a lot shorter than it actually is. It's a feature length, but it zooms by. And so for that and other reasons, I think that this is a very fresh feeling silent film. Yeah.
I'd say too, I think that the lack of makeup, because Dreyer wouldn't allow any of his actors to wear makeup in this film. I honestly think the lack of makeup has a lot to do with the fact that the film feels less dated than some other silent films. A lot of those other silent films, especially the older ones, have this kind of very visible kind of like white makeup, that can look a little goofy today. This film, they didn't use makeup, and they had this new panchromatic film, which was able to show all these nuances of light and shade in a way that like revealed the character's like all the different sort of angles of a character's face and of an actor's face, and the sort of like the crags and pimples and whatever else. So that has an aesthetic effect, but it also has the effect of like a more like realistic, a more like sort of like clear image of the person's face. And I think also, aside from that, the film as we have it today is in quite good shape, I would say. Like the picture is quite good. in comparison to some other silent films. That wasn't always the case. The film has like a really like rocky history as far as like the versions that have been available over the years. But the film as it comes to us today is like really, I would say, we have a good like negative of it now. So looks good.
Yeah, it's kind of extraordinary actually, even the fact that we're recording this in 2022. And really, the version that's up on the Criterion channel right now, and that's drawn from the same source that was a restoration produced in 2015, I believe, which was scanned not from a negative, because the negative, from what I understand, is lost, but from a nitrate print. Nitrate being the old film stock that was used up until the 1930s, roughly. And of course, if you know anyone who's read about it, like they'll tell you about how nitrate's very flammable, so it's a very unsafe film stock. It's why it's not used anymore, and that's why there's been so many archive fires, throughout the history of early cinema, especially. But also, nitrate though does have a compared to the newer version of celluloid that became the standard, acetate, nitrate, has its own kind of qualities to it. They're not probably going to be noticeable to the non-experts, but there's a richness to nitrate film stock. If you kind of get used to comparing them, you will probably start to see some of those differences. And it's incredible that, we have a print that they were able to make a full 4K scan from, and then do a digital restoration. The bottom line is the film in its widely exhibited form that we have today has never looked as good as it does now. And of course, film purists, who prefer projected film would argue with that and say, well, no, that it's always going to be projected film is the standard, which it isn't, of course. But for when you just think of how people have tried to see this film, it plays such a huge role in the formation of kind of the cinephile canon of films that that has been on kind of in steady formation, at least in the French tradition, coming from like the French cinephile tradition of like the 1940s and 50s. This film is huge, in Western cinephilia. And, only in the last several years kind of do we have a version that's brilliantly restored that anyone can see, So I don't know. Yeah. It's just an interesting, like the chapters of like how these things go. You never, lost films being rediscovered, great films being restored. It's always constantly evolving and really. Yeah.
So
wonderful.
Since we're talking about it, the original negative of this film burned in a studio fire in 1929, just a year after the film was released. Wow. And Dreyer was devastated. And what he did was he reconstructed the film almost shot for shot using alternate takes.
Wow.
So there's this little Criterion extra on the Criterion channel or on the DVD or Blu-ray that talks about the different versions, and it compares the same scene in these two different versions. For example, this is how I learned that the bloodletting scene is actually real.
What?
Like they used like an extra or like a crew member or something's
No.
arm. And so they show you two different takes of that simultaneously. And one, the blood just sort of dribbles out. So it's like the lesser take that he had to use for the second version of the film.
My gosh.
Because in the first one, it looks fake because it like spurts out in this perfect arc, into the pan. Yeah.
Wait,
so apparently that was real.
So which one was the first take and which was the alternate?
The one that you saw was the original.
Oh, okay, great, great.
So the original negative burned. Dreyer reconstructs this second version from alternate takes. So another example of difference is like when you see like the dirt being thrown with a shovel and like the skull flies. It like didn't land like right side up in the alternate
Dang,
take.
that must
so
have been
just like not as
so frustrating for him, to like, oh my gosh, that would have been killer.
It is crazy. Yeah. And the negative of the second reconstruction also burned in another studio fire.
Oh, no.
And then various versions from prints of that, I think of that, maybe of the second version, sort of circulated, and somebody in like the 50s or something made a version Dreyer was encouraging people to try to like reconstruct it somehow, and somebody tried one that he hated where they replaced the intertitles with voiceover or something and some other things, but and that was around for like a few decades, and it was basically the print of a print that Nathan referred to, the nitrate print of the original negative, was then found in a janitor's closet of a mental institution in Norway in 1981. And it turned out that I guess Dreyer had been friends with the guy who ran this mental institution. Apparently he was like a friend of his and an expert on stigmata. And and he forgot that he had sent him this thing to look at. And so they discovered it, and it had the title,
wow,
written
that's wonderful
on it. So that's where the version that you'll see today, assuming you don't somehow accidentally end up watching the alternate take version somewhere on YouTube or something, that's the version that you'll see that's on the Criterion channel. And then there's another wrinkle, which is like, do you watch it in 20 frames or 24 frames per second? Both of my viewings, I watched the 20 frames per second, but it sounds like you guys watched the 24 frames.
I did my first viewing, I did 24 frames, and then my second viewing, I did 20 frames.
Okay, so what did you think?
I thought that the 20 frames per second definitely had the impression of being more natural and more lifelike. But
like this movement speed.
Yes. Of course, that adds to the length. I mean, it adds like an additional like 17 or 18 minutes.
20 minutes, yeah.
But I thought that the 24 frames per second also had something going for it. There's like a driving energy to the piece, right, whether you watch it in 24 frames per second or 20 frames per second, but it's definitely accentuated in the faster one, where it's like everything is driving to this climax. Right. And
this is already a film with a lot of quick cuts.
Yeah, that's right. So I just kind of felt like it elevated some of that angst, some of that like tension and drama. It kind of made it more exciting, where the 20 frames per second made it a more contemplative experience.
And you were probably able to see some of the nuances in Falconetti's performance. Better in this
in everybody's performances, you were able to sort of stay with them just that much longer to kind of notice, this little swallow here, or this little movement of the cheek here, or something, which is totally crucial to not just Falconetti's performance, but the whole visual style of this film. So much of the storytelling is conducted in these extreme close-ups of faces, which is another thing that I think gives it this modern feel, is that it's sort of, it lives in the close-up.
But and we'll talk about the visual style in a second. I just wanted to say, while we're on the topic of silent film, diving deep into the technology of silent film, that we mentioned different frame rates, and there's a debate about what frame rate this film should be shown at. And part of the reason for that, is that silent films were not shown at a consistent frame rate from theater to theater, because they were cranked. The projector was hand cranked. And not only that, the cameras were hand cranked, when the film was shooting. So cameramen prided themselves apparently on their steadiness, but sometimes they would be pressured to do, I think, Nathan, maybe correct me on this, but I think slower to use less film or something. Yeah, to use like a lower frame rate. But you can't really go below 16 without like having, blinking and flashing. So there's that whole thing, and people would speed up certain scenes, which is of course something we're familiar with from certain silent films like Modern Times. But in the movie theater, the projectionist would also be hand cranking it, and not everybody would be doing it the same speed. Sometimes they would do it too fast so that they would be able to make more money by showing another showing per day. Certain theaters would do this, and directors would get upset. There's a story of, I don't remember the name of the guy, but another Danish director, Dreyer was Danish, going to see one of his films, and the film was just shown way too fast, and he stands up and starts yelling at the projectionist, and then the police called, and he gets hauled away. He gets arrested. So that's just a little bit of background about frame rates, but that's why people aren't quite sure how fast this thing should be shown at, and they have to reconstruct it from like looking at the score of like the original score, and like there's like, you know, time markers in certain parts, like it says how long this cue should be and stuff, and they're
yeah. Well, one more thing I'd like to say about the different frame rate versions is that, at least in the two that I watched, I felt that the accompanying scores were very appropriate to their particular frame rate. So that I thought that the piano arrangement, what was the name of the composer, the performer?
Some Mie Yamashita or something like that.
I thought that one was probably on an objective level more musically excellent, and it was definitely more emotionally sublime, but not quite as hooky and catchy and snappy as the other one that was done by a couple of guys. One of them,
somebody from Goldfrapp and somebody from Portishead.
Yeah, right.
I'm not familiar with these bands. But.
Yeah, well, so I'm familiar with Goldfrapp, and they're kind of like an electronic group, and you know, it definitely was very moody and definitely very modern, and definitely very rhythmic and driving, and so it just paired very nicely with that 24 frames per second version, whereas the piano score was you know, subtler, definitely still dramatic, but sort of like at a more emotionally sublime level, I would say, sort of like kind of a more delicate thing to savor. So
yeah, it's more, and it's also more of a typical silent film score, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like ragtimey, you know,
not ragtimey, but it's kind of derivative of certain types of like Debussy or certain types of music that would have been relatively recent at the time.
Sure.
And then Nathan, I think you said you watched the main one presented as sort of the main version.
Yeah.
Also 24 frames per second, but this is Voices of Light by, I forget the
Richard
name.
Richard Einhorn, American, I believe American composer.
So this is like a choral orchestral kind of piece, right?
It's very much a it's almost it's an orchestral version. At times it kind of is approaching kind of like almost like a mass, like a Baroque mass kind of thing.
That's cool.
And I guess my understanding, actually, as long as I've been seeing the film, because when I first saw it on DVD at the end of the 2000s, you know, it was with the same score, with Voices of Light. This score was composed in 1994 and has kind of been attached to the film for, 25 years now. I guess I've just come to see it as like the canonical music of the film. I mean, there's a whole debate to be had about whether Criterion Collection gets to decide what's truly canonical when there's so many versions of a silent film out there. I mean, they are also doing their best to, to present different versions. But yeah, my understanding is that the Einhorn score is kind of the mainstream canonical version. And I would say, I mean, I didn't watch the other versions, so I can't really offer an opinion on them, but I don't see a reason to not think of the Einhorn one as the go-to. It's a beautiful piece of music. I struggle a lot normally with silent film, actually, with particularly the music aspect, with that, you meant the piano, the frequency of like kind of piano type scores, not that they're always ragtime, as you guys were saying, but like there's a certain kind of relentlessness about hearing a piano-based score go for an hour and a half that just drives me crazy, like just in like a mental pressure kind of way. And it's very intense. And so I really, I love Voices of Light because, it's a full, rich orchestral work in its own right, and it is like commenting on the music, but it's not really. It stands on its own, really, and I think it accents and complements the film, the images, in a way that is exquisite. And this was my third or fourth viewing of the film with it. Excuse me. And I was struck. This was by far the one that kind of hit me the most as far as seeing the continuity, the congruity between the two, between the music and the image, and just seeing just how knit together they are in, I would say, quite beautiful ways. So yeah, big fan of that version. And if I have a question for you guys that's kind of along these lines, if I can throw this out there, like with so many versions of the same film kicking around, especially silent film, which is already lacking, an element of film that we are used to in our day and age as being intrinsic to experiencing a film. What do you guys think as far as like experiencing the definitive version of this film? Is there any way to kind of find that, or I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
I just do what the Criterion Collection tells me. No, that's obviously not true, because I didn't watch like the definitive version on the channel, and in part I chose not to, because I was like, okay, well, that's clearly the canonical one, so I'm going to go with one of these two alternate versions. And I'm frankly, I'm excited to go back and watch the more canonical one.
Because I just watched the Yamashita piano score twice because I wanted to watch it at 20 frames per second twice.
But yeah, man, I have no idea. I like that a service like the Criterion Channel is able to offer several versions, and I like that it invites you to go back to a film, because I think that especially with these kinds of films, especially one like The Passion of Joan of Arc, you really can't it's not just one and done. You gotta watch it at least a second time.
Although this is a movie that's fully comprehensible,
totally,
in a certain sense,
totally,
in one viewing, unlike Andrei Rublev.
Yeah, well, I mean, I watched Andrei Rublev and found it totally comprehensible in a single viewing. I mean, maybe like that's a different discussion for a different time, but there's a difference between a thing being incomprehensible until the very end, and incomprehensible until you've watched it a second time.
Sure, yeah, that's true.
But yeah, I'm just talking about on the level of appreciation, because I think that with anything else that's not live, we understand this, that you go back to the thing. So whether it's, I forget if we've talked about this on the show before, but whether it's a painting or a novel, a poem, any
music.
Yeah, right. Anything that isn't alive, it's like it sort of begs to be considered, more than once. And I don't know, there's probably like a lot that can be said about that. Maybe that's you lending it some life by giving it like duration in your memory and sort of like returning presence. But yeah, with films like this, like I think that you're only just grazing the surface if you watch a thing one time. So I think it's great when there are several versions of a film that are available. I guess it's a double-edged sword, because some of those might be like, so much noise to like, just get through. I'm thinking about, like if you look for certain short films on YouTube, there'll just be like 1.5 million different scores, that like Joe Schmo has like done and uploaded. But if you can find like some sort of curating body, like the Criterion Collection, or Criteria Collection, I'm getting my
Criterion Collection.
Okay.
Criterion.
Our podcast is called Criteria.
We are Criteria. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I think they perform a great service. Yeah.
The only thing that bothers me is like the thing we were talking about with Andrei Rublev, where they chose which version to restore, you know, and the longer version, like the director's cut or whatever, is the version that wasn't restored. So the sound isn't as good. The visuals aren't as good. That's disappointing to me. I really wish that they had that, both of them, you know, restored. But when it's just different versions like this, I mean, when we were doing the D.W. Griffith stuff with Birth of a Nation and Tolerance, there were all these different versions of the film that were different lengths, not because of the frame rate, but because there were like 40 minutes more material. And we were like, this film's already 3 hours long. Sorry, I'm not watching the 40 minutes longer.
Really see it then.
And thankfully there was an excuse, because the best like restored versions of the film are shorter, are not much like with Andrei Rublev, are not the longest versions. So that, you know, the 3 hour version or whatever is significantly better than the 3 hour and 40 minute version. But still, it was like, I'm sorry, I can't watch that much of this. But yeah, I agree. It's good to have a curator that's still like a gatekeeper that still leaves you with multiple options.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, this is a question that we could debate endlessly. So I'm happy to cap it here. But like, you know, certainly as a filmmaker, you know, these are sometimes things that come up with, you know, you see so many different versions of your film in progress, and then there's always the question of, you know, especially if you take the view of the director, you know, has the final say, and a director like Dreyer certainly, I'm pretty sure, would have had the final say. You know, it's like, if you're looking, it's a philosophical question, you know, like what is the film? What is the version of the film? What is, you know, and then to have so much choice available is stressful, in my opinion, because, you know, if you really want to kind of just drill down to what is the essence of this particular work, you know, just take me to the source. Well, if you it's just, I don't know, it's just interesting, because like this is a thing that comes up frequently in especially with much older films, you know, where we don't necessarily have everything, or there's so much that's been lost with them. And
well, if you belong to any kind of like Criterion Facebook group or whatever, you see people debating these questions, and I think was it Wong Kar-wai who like put out like updated coloring or something on some of his films?
Did. So just for context, Wong Kar-wai is a filmmaker from Hong Kong, I believe, who he made a number of films in the 1990s, so not that long ago. And last year, or within the last few years, in collaboration with the Criterion Collection, he basically did restorations of all of his work up until the 2000s, I believe. And part of that, again, restoration. Now, normally when you think restoration, you're thinking about, we are not adding to it. We are simply uncovering what is already there. We are restoring it. But he took the opportunity, as is his prerogative, to completely redo the credits, redo the font. You know, basically he did an overhaul of the film's presentation, not just the image itself, but kind of like things adjacent to it. He also changed up music. Oh wow! It was, and I think he even changed editing in some parts. Certainly, the biggest change, though, visually. The best example of this is Wong Kar-wai made a film in the mid-1990s called Fallen Angels, and he shot and presented the film then in a normal widescreen ratio, you know, which almost, you know, on your TV at home would almost fill the entire screen. It's the standard 185:1 ratio. So that's just what we recognize as like basic widescreen. With this restoration, he ended up basically cropping the frame. So he's using kind of like the whole frame originally. He ends up cropping it to what's considered to be a wider anamorphic ratio, 239:1. Now that's where you see, you know, for those who don't know film stuff, like that's where the black bars are really coming down almost to the middle of the screen. And it has a more, you know, this is, especially nowadays, this is associated as a cinematic look. And there's a whole host of problems with just calling that cinematic that we won't get into.
Versus like a TV look or something.
But anyway, the point is, he completely changes the nature of the image by reframing. Yeah. And he's losing a lot of his original frame. Like, so it's kind of like him saying like, well, actually, you know, what I was doing in the 90s, it looks better now this way. But it's such a radical change from, what would seem to be the original intention, that it's like, at this point, it's like, it's not really a restoration now. It's a whole new version of the film. There's now, going forward, the old version is going to be a sought after kind of relic for people to find, because it presents supposedly a more pure idea of what he was doing at the time. But the version that we have now is really more reflective of where he is in the 2010s or in the 2020s.
Yeah.
So,
and this,
thank you.
This becomes especially an issue with things that are recorded rather than a live performance. So we have this idea that there's a definitive version, right? As opposed to a live performance thing that only exists in live performance, which you can do it different ways. If it's never recorded, nobody, is worried about that. And then with copyright issues. So there's a whole separate podcast that could be made about this, obviously. But the most famous example is George Lucas. Yeah. Making the special editions of the Star Wars movies. And one of the things that really upsets people is not that he made these different editions and made changes, which people think are bad in some cases, but that he made that the definitive version. And you can't get the original version. Like, he never put out, Blu-ray or DVD of the original version that everybody wants to see. So it's like,
there were DVDs.
I guess, it is his prerogative to. There were, but
it was the same thing as everyone else. They were included as an extra on the definitive set, and they weren't properly, formatted for widescreen TVs. It was, it was basically just like, here you go. But like, they're not making it actually watchable,
So there's a whole ethical thing. Is like, people, feel like at a certain point the work of art belongs to the public, and then that can the artist just do whatever he wants with it, or at least can he prevent you from seeing the version that you're accustomed to? Whereas Bach would go back and edit his pieces over years and years, and as they would be put to a different use, used at a different function than their original or whatever. But there was the scores were all his. These things weren't all published at the time publicly, so it was just his. There was no one definitive version necessarily. Maybe in his mind there was, and then people can debate that later. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with Christopher Tolkien editing the Silmarillion and having to come to a definitive version from all these different drafts from decades apart. So there's, I don't know that there is ultimately a perfect answer to these problems.
It's just a fascinating, and just, it's a fascinating example of just kind of like, in some ways, human frailty, because, and everyone will have a different opinion on this, but for one filmmaker that just springs to mind, for those who've seen films by Michael Mann, who is an incredible director, in my opinion, his best work is actually, it tends to be the stuff that he releases theatrically, and then often he'll go back and tweak things a bit for home video or for later director's cut. He has these kind of second guessing things, and not to say that those aren't worth watching, but to me the superior ones always tend to be what he originally made. And it's almost like this second guessing. It's a thing that a lot of people, anyone is susceptible to it, right? But it's interesting, like, there's something about film in particular, because it is a recorded medium, it is really capturing a particular moment of a director and his team and his actors, like, just making certain decisions. But it all comes down to the director's decision eventually. Like, it captures a moment, and then when they go back and tinker, like, they really are, they're trying to, it's kind of imposing a will from a different moment onto that moment in a way that's different from a master composer kind of going back and reapplying what he now knows more about music, his talent, just his development as a musician. And I guess because those performances, were not recorded, it's like they're gone. So it's like there's the potential to just every new one now forward will be the more perfect version of what he always wanted to do. I don't know. Right. It's one of those mysteries of art.
Yeah. And now when you buy an album by the Beatles or the Beach Boys, they give you the option of, like, some of them will have both the stereo versions, which were added later, and the original mono versions, stuff like that. Kieślowski, we discussed his Decalogue films. He said something about, because he had to deal with censorship and stuff. And he said something like he didn't like this thing where directors would then, go back and add the thing that they would have had if it wasn't censored. because like he doesn't want to be looking back and like regretting the film that he made. He basically said it was like unmanly to do that.
That's cool.
He thought like you just have to like commit and accept the film that you made under those circumstances.
Yeah. And listen, like the restrictions can be productive, you know, or they often are. And I wonder if, you know, in this case, talking about Joan of Arc, you know, just for a filmmaker being aware that my film is going to be showed at a variable frame rate, that it's going to sort of be living anywhere between like 17 to 27 frames per second, and being conscious of that reality while you're making the film. Also being aware that, you know, you're not going to have control over the musical accompaniment. You know, my understanding is that, you know, at the time it was just every theater had their resident musicians coming in and playing something along with the film. And so I think, you know, to me, when it comes to how a silent film is presented, the version in which it's seen, to me, it seems more analogous to sort of how a painting is displayed in a museum, or, you know, like how a poem is read. You know, it's like it sort of necessity has to be kind of editorialized, for lack of a better word. You know, there has to sort of be like a third perspective, kind of helping to like put this in front of an audience. And so choices that are like not the directors or not the filmmakers necessarily need to be made. And I guess you kind of hope that that's something that's kind of taken into account in the process, you know.
I guess you could say if you wanted to be a perfect control over the work, you should have been a performing artist instead of a composer or a poet, or, you know, whatever.
Totally. But, you know, also, you know, the filmmaker is able to exercise control over what he can exercise control, you know, and I think that in this film, watching it, I don't know anything about Dreyer or about how this film was made, but the impression I got was that this was a director very heavily involved in every aspect of the film. Right. You know, sometimes you watch a film and the director's hand is a little more invisible. You know, for a trained eye, you're always going to be able to like sort of see what's going on there. But I think here, you know, for me as an actor, that was the first thing that jumped out at me, was like, wow, I really get the impression that this is a director who is working really closely with his actors and really like fine tuning the kinds of expressions and the nuance and the pacing and the, you know, subtle shifts and glances and nods that for an actor, I mean, maybe some really good actors are really good at knowing how they're coming across on the screen, but I think that probably no matter who you are, and especially if you're an actor or an actress in like the 1920s, I think it's going to be really difficult. It is really difficult to know how you're appearing. I mean, you can't really. The camera's pointed at you, but you don't know really where you are in the frame or like how it's coming across or how the light is hitting you. And so you're really kind of dependent upon the feedback that you're getting from the director of photography or from the filmmaker himself. And here, there's not just such a sense of precision in the performances and sort of nuance and subtle detail, but it's of a kind of uniform aesthetic. Right. You know, there are different characters and different, you know, there's like each character may have like a different tone, a different personality, certainly, but there's like they all sort of cohere together. They're all in the same world, and also they all sort of exist together stylistically. and that's where I think you really see the director's hand. Like, okay, yeah, here's a director who really knows what he's going after and who's really able to bring the performances of each of these actors and this actress in particular playing Joan of Arc to deliver what he's looking for, and I'd be interested to know, how that was done, how many takes had to be done. You were mentioning how he was able to rebuild the entire film from alternate takes. So certainly there was nothing that was done in like, all right, one take, we've got it,
No Clint Eastwood Passion of Joan of Arc exists.
Yeah, this doesn't seem like that kind of a film, But then, if I can just like monologue a little bit longer, I think that you can also see this director's, like hand really fine tuning a lot of other things as well. So, it's I think that this film is like visual storytelling at its finest. And I mean, there's a lot that could be said about that. I could again talk about the performances, because so much is conveyed just in these glances. You'll have an entire sequence of like ecclesiastical intrigue and conspiracy without any intertitles to tell you what's being said or what's going on. It's clear, from the way people are looking at each other and from the way the camera is panning to like these focal points of action. But the way that he's always up in people's faces. I mean, I at a certain point watching the film, I thought like, how many different ways can you shoot a face, but the whole film virtually lives in this close up and it's always fresh, it's always new angles. It's always catching new, it's evoking new things. And
right.
Yeah.
But yeah, please jump in. Yeah, I'll keep going, if you don't stop me.
Well, I love that point because, and that's it brings up, if you compare, the idea, so there's the idea that like the actor is kind of the heart of a film, of a narrative film, right? And there's a lot of truth to that, and there's this sort of like well-worn wisdom out there, old chestnut about your film can be terrible, it could look visually poor, but if you have a good story, you have a good actor, like you can kind of just spin gold out of it still, right? And there's truth to that. Sometimes I think that's rolled out to justify very rotely shot dramas and whatnot, especially what you see on television, going through the whole history of TV and its influence, especially Hollywood, basically what we would call the coverage principle, where it's like, in order to shoot economically, to get everything done in one day, you have to pick certain shots, medium, wide, close up, and you have to repeat the scene with each one. And then basically you're not so much choosing the best way to shoot it on the day. You're kind of just getting as much coverage of people as you can. And then in editing, you'll kind of figure out the dramatic stuff, you'll figure out how it all cuts together. And that's where the real art happens. Passion of Joan of Arc, is completely opposed to that because, as you say, James, like every shot, feels like its complete own thing. That's one of the most amazing things about the film, in that it feels like a filmmaker. I think it demonstrates a filmmaker and his creative team finding the most appropriate, and I mean that in like the Aristotelian kind of way, finding the most perfect thing that they set out to do, for each shot, and part of that is not that they are kind of copying the same frame over and over and over, but it's like almost like, every frame, has its own life to it, has its own appropriateness to it, and it feels different, but of a unity. It feels personal, and the way I summarize it is like it feels personal. It feels new. Like everything in that film feels new. Nothing feels rehashed or copied, and that's the effect that you get from coverage filmmaking, where it's like you're like, clearly this was from the previous shot. Right. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are a few moments in the film where it's like, I'm sure they are cutting back to the same shot and stuff like that. But each shot in and of itself, each setup, you could say, has its own unity, the composition has its own character, its own quality, and it's all part of a whole. But it really does stand out as like each shot is truly beautiful in its own way, and that's very rare to find.
This is why Eisenstein,
any film.
This is why Eisenstein, who very much inspired this film with his montage approach, Battleship Potemkin was a huge influence on this film. When he saw this film, he said, it's very interesting, very beautiful, but it's not really a film. It's just a series of wonderful photographs, which some people obviously would disagree with. But
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that there are moments in the film that, are Eisensteinian-ish, like Eisensteinian, in their pacing and their not so much in like juxtaposing ideas the way he would, where he's trying to make a political point, but like there are moments like the film is not a laid back affair, as we were saying at the beginning of this of the chat. Like it's a fast moving film, and it's abrasive at times. There's these abrasive cuts that if you watch other Joan of Arc films, they definitely don't make those same decisions where they'll let you contemplate things more. And what I find, I guess what I'm trying to get to in noting that is, it very much falls into this mode of filmmaking, which kind of really comes out of the Soviet school, the idea of the Kuleshov effect, which I think you guys have discussed on here before.
Not by that name.
You might have talked about it with Tarkovsky, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like anyway, just briefly, the Kuleshov effect is just this, there was a filmmaker, or a theorist in the 1920s named Kuleshov who juxtaposed different images together with a man's face. And the man's face was this kind of like blank expression, but depending on what he cut, what he showed before showing the man's face, whether it was a piece of fruit or a child laughing or a skull or something, I forget the exact ones, but it was all like, one was like very sorrowful, one was very happy, one was fearsome or whatever. And the effect is like the man's seeing the same face, you get a different sense, you get a different idea. It seems like he's reacting to each of the images. And so, there's this very kind of subjective a quality to it, and you see this playing out, I think, in Joan of Arc, the way that certain glances, the way that they cut, there are many glances and gestures in the film, especially with Maria Falconetti's performance, that like, they're using the art of editing to imply things and accentuate things, and it's very much a film of its time in that way. It's a very like. It's not a Soviet film, but it's a film that I have a hard, like, it's funny hearing the Eisenstein comment, because like, it's very much applying the kind of the results that the Soviets in particular were doing by making film into this very malleable, like totally kind of material, like let's just manipulate film to do whatever we want kind of thing,
Well,
sorry.
Well, it is,
if I could just jump in.
Sure.
I was going to say that, for as specific as all of these moments with each of these performers and capturing each of these qualities is, there's definitely still that level of specificity, that same specificity on the level of the editing.
Right.
Because there are some sequences that are just like the imagery is just stunning. One sequence when she's in the torture chamber and they're beginning to like rev up the torture instruments, and this spiky wheel is spinning and it's like cutting to like all these different, images of different torture devices, and then her face, and then they're like, laying on the pressure, and it's like this really rich imagery that's just like bombarding you. And that's like, that's totally built in the editing there, and so Dreyer just is sort of demonstrating his mastery of like all of these different things that a director can exercise control over. And it's really remarkable. One more thing I wanted to say about the editing was that, I think it's really significant that throughout the film, rarely does Joan occupy the same frame as her interlocutors or the people who are interrogating her. And so the effect is something that's like really adversarial and really intense as you're switching back and forth, back and forth, back and forth from these different perspectives. You know, all these different people who are asking her questions or scrutinizing her in different ways, and then just back to this 19-year-old girl. You know, I think that you could probably count on one hand the number of times you see her in frame with any of these other people. Certainly more often with like the priests who are like the good priests.
The editing style of this film is really closer to pure juxtaposition, and that creates some ambiguity too as to the visual space and the meaning of the shots. I mean, so David Bordwell, this well-known film historian and critic, I think he wrote a book analyzing this film, like sort of its visual style and shot for shot. And he says, of the film's over 1,500 cuts, fewer than 30 carry a figure or object over from one shot to another, and fewer than 15 constitute genuine matches on action. In other words, so when you're looking from one character to another, it's not even clear if they're always looking at each other, or like, you know, like when Joan's reacting to something, it's not always totally clear what she's reacting to, or vice versa. So there's character ambiguity of character moments and what somebody's looking at, but there's also this ambiguity in the space, which is related not just to the editing style, but to the focus on close-ups, because the film doesn't really have any true, like, full establishing shots that really situate you unambiguously in the space.
There really is very little sense of space in this film.
And there's many examples you could give of that, but like for example, like in the scene where they first bring her into the torture room, like you're seeing just like one side of the room, and there's no indication that there's this whole other area in the room with the wheel and, you know, different things. So there's a number of situations like that. Or when they bring in the sacraments towards the end of the film, it's like suddenly you're seeing this whole wide open space where they're processing down this hallway, and you're like, wait, is this the same room we were just in? And it's interesting because this was one of the most expensive film sets ever built for a European film up to that time. They had a budget of 7 million francs, and they built this huge octagonal concrete set to depict the Rouen castle.
That's amazing.
They were inspired by medieval miniatures. They added some expressionistic unnatural angles and perspectives. That, like, for example, when it pans out or when it zooms out from a little bit from the guy who's presiding over the trial, you see the two windows above him. One of them is like, they're like not parallel to each other.
There's three windows, and they're like they're like they're like your Wi-Fi bars.
Right. Exactly. They're kind of off kilter. You know, they relied on medieval manuscripts. They built the whole set as one complete interconnecting structure, instead of separate locations. Towers, concrete walls 10 centimeters thick, so they can support the weight of the actors and the technicians and the equipment. There's a functional drawbridge. There's houses inside. There's a courtyard, a cathedral. The whole set was apparently painted pink, so it would appear gray in the black and white. But,
I take back what I said, because it really isn't that there is little sense of space here. It's just that it's like, it's a very peculiar sense of space.
You don't know how it all relates to each other is the point.
Yeah, but there's definitely an effect there, and you're definitely aware of it.
You're just seeing small fragments.
You're just getting small fragments, yeah. But it definitely has an effect. And you know what it reminds me of actually is Therese, which we talked about.
Yes, but it's even more radical, I'd say.
Yeah, go expound on that.
Well, so in Therese, we have no establishing shots. But we do have like a pretty firmly established sense of space when they're moving from one part of the stage to another, and the camera's following them. There's a lot more continuity of shots. There's like a certain, you know, from what direction you're looking. Like there's just a more, it's more of like a minimalism in the sets than it is a like total ambiguity in the space,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
That's a good point.
And so this
No, it
is
does.
even more radical, I would say, in its approach. And he was given freedom to shoot it the way he wanted. And he was given this budget to make this. There's a story that the producers were really like pulling their hairs out over the fact that he didn't use this really, he never showed you this whole set that was so expensive.
It's similar, it reminds me a bit, I guess I might disagree a bit with the comparison with Therese in that, I guess, like with what Dreyer is doing here, he builds his entire set and then he just kind of runs freely within it without feeling any need to like situate us. In some ways that reminds me a bit of like the work of Terrence Malick, where it's kind of like, the purpose is, it's not about establishing space. Not that, I want to be clear, Malick is great at establishing space, in my opinion, but he's not concerned about it so much where that's becomes like the overriding thing. But he basically, his whole the goal is to play, is what I'm trying to get. It's like, you have this space. The space is not simply to impress the viewer, it is to create like a sense of like this is the setting that we're in. But it's really, you could say Dreyer's using it primarily for the actors. It's really for the actors in order to access the what they need to access, to have the sense of realism that they need to get into character. And the audience, like, the concern is not to share that space with the audience. It's really to share what the actors are accessing with the audience. And I just find that kind of fascinating and wonderful, because it's very playful in a sense. It's really kind of saying, what do we need to do here? Let's go get it. And for Dreyer, just as if you understand the context of his work, he came out of this tradition of filmmaking in the 1920s called Kammerspiel film, German word, which basically was these like kind of bourgeois chamber dramas. It comes out of the theatrical tradition of people sitting on couches and having problems, and that's kind of how he cut his teeth as a filmmaker. And then as soon as he gets kind of the clout and the money to, the freedom to do whatever he wants, he does away with that entirely, with those fixed shots, that sort of more stagey feel. And it's just like, let's just dive into this and play with it. And then if you follow the rest of his career, he never goes back to the same level as Joan. Joan is like an outlier in his work for this kind of intense close-up stuff. Like the rest of his career is defined by these much more stately tracking shots, which you see some of that in Joan. There's these beautiful dolly shots moving up and down. Yeah, moving up and down the space. And he has the space to do it, which is incredible. Like he's been doing these wonderful, you get to really stretch out in this space. The rest of his career is basically doing stuff like that, where it's these very carefully composed, kind of slower moving, and always in motion kind of way of shooting a film. So I don't know. It's just
we'll be watching another of his films.
Like he let it all out. He let it all out on this one, and it really paid off.
We'll be watching another of his films, so we will have a chance to compare when we watch Ordette, which is a sound film from the 50s. I think that's the only instance here where we're on the Vatican film list where we have a silent film and a sound film by the same director. So that should be interesting. But a modern director today might, I have this whole set and it's all constructed in one piece. Well, I'm going to make the whole film one shot. And we're just going to go through, you know what I mean? That's exactly.
Did you just call Dreyer the Alejandro Inarritu of his time?
Well, because but I mean, he's certainly not the only, the only one. But I
don't know if we can handle that.
But So Dreyer talked about that the reason for shooting so much of the film in close up, and he said there were questions. It was basically based on his study of the trial transcripts, which the bulk of the dialogue in the film is based on. He said that only that approach could convey what he called the close quarter combat of the trial. Wow. He said there were questions, there were answers, very short, very crisp. Each question, each answer quite naturally called for a close-up. In addition, the result of the quote close-ups was that the spectator was as shocked as Joan was receiving the questions and tortured by them.
Wow. That's cool.
Yeah.
Close quarter combat.
And so that's
spot on.
And that enables this unique acting style, not only of Falconetti, but of all these actors in the films, the way that he shoots them differently, because he's just focused on a few actors at a time or one actor at a time. He lights them differently. The priest and her interrogators are shot high contrast, and that sort of like shows their unappealing details in their faces to be fully visible. She's given this soft, even lighting. He does low angle shots of her persecutors, which make them more like sort of intimidating. There's also, I just throw this in here because there's nowhere else we'll talk about it and we won't go into it, but he shot the film from the first to the last scene in the order of this film, which is very rarely done, which means that the priest actors who had to shave their heads to get tonsures, they had to keep it for long periods of time. They couldn't just do it for a week and then grow it back. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that the actors had to go through, but yeah.
Can I just make like, again, everything you're saying just goes into this whole, I just find the film fascinating for how it's chasing a kind of realism. It's really, there's like, it explicitly starts by saying this is based on a historical account. We're not trying to do like a legend here. We're trying to do the history. We're going to the sources. We're doing this modern scientific kind of like excavation of
right. I mean, the first
Joan
shot
of Arc story
is taking out the manuscript.
Right.
Yeah. It's almost like, it really is like basically almost saying like we're doing history here, and then everything into the intensity of the emotions and like trying to place you in the trial. And yet anyway, all that stuff you just mentioned, Thomas, about it's really kind of driving towards this desire for realism. But I just find it so striking that at the film's kind of most climactic moments, it's again, with what we were talking about with the editing earlier, like it really kind of moves away from realism. It's moving really more towards surrealism,
with the gestures in the circus atmosphere and
and like surrealism, of course, was like hand in hand with film in the 1920s. Like they were very close friends, in artistic movements and things like that. But it's just striking how that drive for realism, you kind of end up somewhere else that's much more, again, like subjective, idealistic.
And the film also ends with a complete departure from history with this riot that breaks out, which is not from the transcripts.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought that up, Nathan, because this was something that I was definitely thinking about, especially on my second viewing of the film. Because I always try to pay attention to what are like the opening moments, what are the opening images, like what does the filmmaker give us to kind of like color the rest of our viewing of this film. And it's definitely significant that like from the beginning, he's like hammering home that these transcripts are real and like, it's like the original based on a true story, but of course now when we see based on a true story, we're almost like conditioned to dismiss it and be like, okay, like
Fargo,
how based on a true story is this? But here you're basically given to think like, wow, this is just the transcripts. Now, to what degree that's the case or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that if you do actually just watch this movie without that sort of preface, this is not a film that's like concerned about realism. It's definitely grounded in a realism, right? And I think that's what that opening sequence is doing. I think that probably Dreyer is intuiting or understanding that audiences need to be grounded in the reality of this, because what he's about to do is take it to some pretty stylized places.
Right.
It's nothing like, like crazy and avant-garde, but it is like intense and it is definitely of a style. And and it's not realism. I mean, the first time you see Joan of Arc's expression, this isn't realism.
Right.
I mean, like
the realism is more the dialogue a lot of it being taken directly from the transcripts. It's not the stylistic realism.
Right. But I think that Dreyer probably wants to ground it in a sense of realism so that the stylistic choices can sort of be sustained, if that makes sense,
Sure.
It's almost like you don't even notice that you're watching something highly stylized. You accept it on its own terms.
Yeah.
But actually it's very, very highly stylized, from the performances to the cinematography to the set dressing, and actually it to me, it seems to be of a piece with the same impulse to build this totally expensive, detailed recreation set and then not really utilize it.
Right.
It's like, well, we need to ground this in a reality, because what we're going to try to do is take this into the stratosphere, you know? And if I can draw one more parallel, I think that it's also on display in the choice to show the bloodletting. You know, this is a film that deals with a very gruesome subject, which is, you know, the martyrdom of Saint Joan of Arc, her burning at the stake ultimately. And it has there's a lot of potential for violence here. I mean, you know, the whole sequence in the torture chamber is very mercifully handled from a filmmaking perspective, because we don't see anything, you know, gruesome or gory or anything, but it's definitely horrifying. And what I think Dreyer accomplishes with this bloodletting scene where they're like, oh, she's you know, has a fever or whatever, and so we need to drain her blood, because that's gonna help. But it's just this like several seconds of an arm spewing blood,
Right.
and
an arm actually being pierced, and
I didn't know that, but like, you don't have to know that for the effect to be the effect, which is like, my goodness, I am looking at an arm being pierced and spewing blood. And I think that what that does is it grounds everything in a kind of reality, so that later the burning at the stake can be very stylized, very suggestive, not graphic per se, but no less effective. You know what I mean? Because we've already been prepared with this prior scene of the bloodletting, in the same way that we had been prepared by this prior scene of the manuscript with the you know, the transcripts. That Dreyer is like conditioning his audience to view this film in a particular way.
He wanted it to be a documentary in a sense,
Yeah.
even though the style is not documentary. The famous writer and director Jean Cocteau said this film was like an historical document from an era in which reportage didn't exist. Meaning, I'm assuming he meant like cinematic reportage.
reportage.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So
I guess that there's certain, every so often there are films that they usually take place outside of modern times, and they have that sense of like, that basically they seem to tap into a worldview or a psychology that is so alien to our own, and I could see how this film would be like that as well. You know, it stands alone in certain ways.
So James, we've made a lot of references to the acting style in this film, but we have never really described it directly. So, and for the sake of time, maybe if you want to just describe how you would put Falconetti's acting style, since you said that that in a way the whole ensemble is of a piece in their approach. Maybe that we could just focus on Falconetti's approach and how
well, I've said on the show before that for me, like, the hallmark of really great film acting is in the eyes. You know, that's not the case on stage, because you know, a lot of the time you're in a situation where people can't see your eyes, you know, and they need to be like outlined with makeup. But
I should note, this is only one of 2 films she made, I believe. She was mainly a stage actor.
With her, I mean, everything is in the eyes, you know? From the first time you see her, that's what hits you is, my goodness, these eyes, you know, and they're speaking. But that's true of all the performances here, that there's so much that's conveyed in the looks, you know, whether it's like contempt, you know, or haughtiness or outrage or intimidation or, you know, scheming, supplication or, you know, suffering or, you know, hopelessness, or, I mean, like, one of my favorite moments is right after Saint Joan of Arc receives communion. there's just like such a incredible quality to her gaze as she like looks up in prayer. And in fact, a lot of the shots of Falconetti have an iconic quality to them. They almost look like you could take them and just slap them into a stained glass window, and here is like an icon of a saint.
Right.
She even has the face of a like a icon of the Theotokos, like the from Our Lady of Vladimir or something like that, like the classic Russian Byzantine icons of Our Lady. Like she has that kind of facial structure as well, which I think that's what you're saying.
So I would say that like the main thing going on in her performance is what's happening in her eyes, but then there's like a level of precision and focus of what she's doing with other different parts of her face. I mean, at that level of close up, the slightest twitch of the eye, is as dramatic as like, me like waving my arms across the stage, to people in the upper balcony. Because when you're zoomed in that close, the slightest change in facial features, we notice it. So Dreyer is very much like painting with these strokes, and you can almost see him giving the instructions to the actors, like, okay, here you're going to let your grimace turn into a frown, or here you're going to slowly raise your eyebrow, or slowly turn your face, or here you're gonna twitch your left eye, or I don't know if he was
I can tell you about I can tell you about this method if you want, and how they worked.
Sure. But I'll just finish up by saying that's very much part of the visual storytelling here. Is what are the subtle things that are going on in the faces, sometimes just for a split second, but definitely with Falconetti, it's like not only does Dreyer find a million different ways to shoot her face, she finds a million different ways to like express and emote with nothing but her face. I mean, it's really quite challenging as an actor to be robbed of the entire rest of your body. Now, of course, I'm certain the rest of her body is activated, that she's using the rest of her body to achieve what she's doing with her face. But of course, we're not seeing the rest of what she's doing with her body. All we're seeing is what she's doing with her face. So, she could be running on a treadmill for all we know, but what we're seeing is everything's focused in here, and that's it's raw, it's intense, it's interior. That's definitely one of the effect that's given, not just from her performance but from others, is like you get the sense of what's going on interiorly beneath the surface, of people.
In that respect, I would compare it to the performance in Therese as well. That is this deeply interior performance, but again, I think more radical because of the limitations of the way that it's shot, and just like the greater intensity of the emotions on display for the most part. Because of the fraught situation in which the whole film takes place. Can
I ask just a quick question, James? Just with regards to what you're saying about the I guess kind of like the infinite renewability, the constant newness of what she's doing. Do you think that is kind of like coming out of her craft as an actor, that like it's 100% that, or is it kind of like part of just the infinite potentiality of being of a human face? I guess I wonder, how much do you think it's like accidental? How much do you think it's intentional?
I think it has to be coming out of her craft. I mean, it's miraculous, if you ask me, this performance. Like, I can't tell you how hard that is to do. To not just look like the same in every scene. But especially in something like this, where it's like it would become so easy for something to just be one note. And oftentimes the more the more fraught the emotion, the more one note a performance becomes.
Yeah.
It becomes really, really difficult to find nuance at those really like high pitched emotions. But she's like crying in half the scenes. But I really think that she's finding different colors, different intentions, different responses. I mean, she's conveying so much information to us, the audience, with the way she's responding to everything that's being done around her.
Yeah.
It's like a definitive performance, if you ask me. Like, I mean, this could go up there as like best film performance of all time. You know, I would feel comfortable saying that.
And if
it's usually on the short list whenever like I mean, it's all the lists, but like that whenever it comes up, she's usually at the top of the list.
And James,
what I've seen,
as far as this renewability is concerned, I think you indicated that this is true to some extent of the other actors as well. I mean, and that may be a question of writing and directing as well. But there's a lot of situations where you're seeing these actors in the same. There's a limited number of scenarios that these actors are in the film, right? But some of the main inquisitors, you do get different nuances of the same emotions or different moments and different asides and stuff that keep it fresh, even though they're often sort of doing the same things.
I'll tell you one that's really remarkable is right at the end, after she's signed her confession and then she's taken back and she's gotten her hair cut and she recants and says she's made a mistake. And the Grand Inquisitor, I guess he's the bishop. He comes in and for the first time there's like this like fatherly quality in him. I don't know if you got that too, but the way that he's framed and the juxtaposition of the way that she's framed and the kind of expression in his face, there's like a tenderness that isn't present for any of the preceding films.
He's not yelling at her there like in so many of the other parts, and you get that with some of the other actors in that scene too, because it's like now they know, oh, now this is real and we're actually going to kill her. And you see this like these moments of them just like processing it and looking kind of like bummed out. Oh, like this is real. Like it's come to the point we don't have any other choice. We either have to like renounce everything what we've been doing or we're going to have to kill this girl.
Yeah. Which, I mean, you got to imagine is probably not far from what it was actually like,
James, you were just talking about how with the greater intensity of emotion, there's more danger that an actor's performance become one note, which brings me to one aspect of the performance that I do want to discuss and see what we all think of, which is the bug eyes. Because that's if there's one aspect that does tempt me to see it as one note or as not as specific as it could be, it's that. So there's a lot of moments throughout the trial, and I think it mainly features in two ways. It features in like bug-eyed terror or being overwhelmed by her circumstances, and then like bug-eyed like mysticism, where like whenever they bring up her visions or something, or she has to answer a different question, she's sort of like looking up with bug eyes. And it reminds me of, there's actually a French painting of Joan of Arc from the 19th century in the Met here in New York City, which, James, maybe you've seen this, where she's standing in her garden and she's having her vision of these saints or in her father's garden. I can't
remember.
Anyway, she's got a very wide-eyed gaze in that, but it appears more focused than I think that the wide-eyed gaze in this film is. Whereas this, it feels more of like an ecstasy or something. It's less of like I'm focused on something. It's less grounded than most of the other aspects of her performance. I don't know where to go with that, but I'm curious what you thought of those moments in particular, because those are the moments where it felt perhaps least, I don't want to say realistic because it's not a per se realistic film, and that's not the issue that I have with it, but least grounded in some way, spiritually.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I definitely think that is where it gets the least realistic, and I think that you're right to basically observe that that's not the point. I think that this is partly maybe why we need that opening shot of the transcript, because within a few moments we're going to see this bug-eyed Joan of Arc, and we're going to have to like stay with that, and I think that it's done for effect. I think that it's it's a stylistic gesture, and I think that it accomplishes what it intends to achieve, and I don't think that it's overdone. I think that maybe it goes right up to the border of being too much.
Yeah.
But if it weren't for the fact that there's like so much color and variety in all of these other moments with her, it might sort of be something of like a dock against the performance.
Yeah.
But I think that like what is remarkable about it is that she's able to integrate it into, the whole.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a really intense gesture. It's as intense as, like some sort of like improvised dance sequence in the middle of Hamlet or something, it's like a really intense gesture.
Sounds like you're giving an example of something you've actually witnessed.
No. but what I mean is that like this is stylistic. This is a departure from realism. This has got to be. This is an intentional choice. But it's something that's like very evocative. It has an effect, and it's integrated into the whole. So that, it's like a feature that we can kind of like joke about, but is not ultimately detrimental.
Yeah.
I think if I could add to that, like, I think it does work because Dreyer and Falconetti commit so hard to it, to the point where there start to be nuances in how the eyes widen, and it's like, it's why it can be terror and mysticism, and you start to pick that up as you go along, which is which, and they commit to it, and it's very much committing. In my opinion, it's very much committing to a symbolic mode. They're trying to navigate the great problem, and we've talked about this, especially in the Therese episode, of the problem of depicting sanctity on screen. It's for films dealing with saints, like this is the number one problem. How do you convincingly capture the reality of someone's sanctity without it, being false in a sense? And I guess the solution that Dreyer goes for is to commit to the kind of symbolic aspect of this is what and really it does. You can see, like, I looked at that painting that you mentioned, Thomas, and I have it on my other monitor, and it's absolutely, I can totally see, like, it's stunning. Like, it totally works. The wide-eyedness,
but it does feel more like she's looking at something in the painting.
It does, yeah. But it's still like it's a hyper, it's not sure how to describe it, but it's not exactly realistic, right? I can see why, they would sort of take that approach out of the visual tradition around saints and Joan of Arc. And I think it does work ultimately, because they kind of get rid of their scruples with it, and they go like, okay, we know that this might not be, fully realistic, but we're going to commit to it as an artistic choice. And, like everything in art, you got to commit, if you kind of second guess, you're dead.
Someone like that, comes into my tribunal, I don't even need to question him. I'm just going to burn him at the stake,
I guess those are the moments that are least convincing for me. And I think part of it for me is just that, I think that even in the intensity of the situation, I don't think that every mention of her visions would just send her into, like, as though she were experiencing them again, or kind of thing. There's some people have found this film is called The Passion of Joan of Arc, and some people have commented that this film puts her in like a very passive role in a way. Somebody, I think it was an interview.
Is that a criticism?
It's just distinction from the historical record, because it's not necessarily a criticism, but it's a choice that they've made. I think it was an interview with the the composer who did the Voices of Light score, because he did a lot of his own research in composing that score. And he said that what he found in reading the trial transcripts, and I did look at some summaries of the transcripts on Wikipedia myself, that, you know, she was actually quite self-possessed. We do see a little bit of her sort of peasant cunning in this film, but she was able to get her interrogators to ask questions sequentially rather than at the same time, get them to refer back to their own records. She was able to end the sessions at her own preference. People were very impressed by her prudence in answering questions. She made several escape attempts. She jumped out a window at one point prior to her trial, and was injured. It jumped out of like a really high window. She would do various things, and there's hints of this in the movie, but I think the focus is more on her just sort of like raw suffering of the moment. And that suffering in a broad sense includes these like moments where she's like transfixed with the wide eyes, whether it's because of terror or because of sort of the spiritual things that are going on.
Right. And you know what the film ends up being for me a lot larger than just about St. Joan of Arc. Mm-hmm. You know, it ends up being for me kind of like an extended meditation on martyrdom, because her martyrdom has already begun at the beginning of the film, you know, and so you're kind of like going through all these different phases of it, you know, and seeing how she's suffering it, and so that's like one of the ways the film is operating for me.
We don't see her military. We don't see anything before the trial. There's no flashbacks.
No.
We don't see her leading armies into battle. We don't see too much of Joan, the national French hero.
Right.
This film, there's references to it. This film was not made by a Frenchman. It wasn't made by a Catholic either. A lot of the French were very suspicious that this was going to be a botch job because only a Frenchman could make. And they were especially upset because there was a rumor that Lillian Gish was going to be the lead, and they didn't want this American actress playing Joan of Arc, you know.
Wow.
So it ended up being somewhat successful, but So I wanted to just before we'll have to wrap up soon, but James, you mentioned in speculating about the director actor relationship here, you said, well, an actor can't always see themselves, but actually I wanted to say that actually was a huge part of the process of making this film.
What I mean is that the actor doesn't know how they're appearing in the moment that they're performing, right? So what ends up you having to happen is that you have to then cut, review the take.
I see. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah.
Or you have to rely on input as you're doing it, but it's very it's almost impossible as you're shooting to have like a good idea of how you're appearing in the moment.
Yeah. So the way that they would work, and Dreyer was big on letting the interpretation arise from what the actor had already given and then working with that. They would watch the rushes of a single scene together 7 or 8 times until Dreyer could pick out like a very small chunk where the effect was exactly what they wanted. And then they would reshoot the scene and she would like just hit that perfectly just based on like a few feet of film. And she just became, over the process of making the film, she just became able to play scenes like that. And then ultimately, based on that process, to be able to just play things based on his explanation without any need for rehearsal and just like nail the exact, like precise emotion they were going for.
Wow. That's awesome.
So this film was ultimately, I think, pretty well received, but there were some moments at the beginning where the church in France, in particular, prior to the French premiere, we have reason to believe that prior to the Paris premiere, the Archbishop of Paris made them cut certain things from the movie. For example, not as we've seen it, we're seeing everything, but for example, apparently the scene where the bishop refuses Joan communion to sort of blackmail her to get her to sign this document was cut for the Paris premiere. specifically. So I don't know exactly what it would have been that they would have objected to there. Maybe that it was just like that use of the Eucharist was just too, sacrilegious or something.
Is there a historical basis? I assume there was a historical basis for that scene, but maybe
I don't know if that was based on the notes. There was a lot of her asking to have her confession heard, and them denying it. And there was, for example, the scene at the beginning in this film, they ask her to say the Our Father, and she refuses. It's because she's just explained that she was taught it by her mother, and she's very emotional thinking about her mother. And in the screenplay by Dreyer, it explains that that's because she was just too overwhelmed with emotion, and it was like too painful for her to like say the Our Father at that moment. Later she does. But in the trial transcripts, it says it's because she refused to do it, except for in the context of them giving her a priest to hear her confession. So that was part of her, like, I guess, trying to, like, being very self-possessed and like trying to change the circumstances of her trial and get certain things happening. And so that in itself is sort of indicative of the approach that he takes with this character, I guess. But I don't know that. I do know that the riot is totally made up. And
yeah, I think that was really the single misstep of the film.
Yeah, because
I thought that it actually ended up having somewhat of an anticlimactic effect, because everything in the film is driving to this climactic moment of Joan's ultimate sacrifice, her death at the stake. But then it's almost immediately sort of the emotional, drama of that is sort of immediately subsumed into this like other story about like a massacre of like the onlookers, that I'm thinking like, I never heard anything like this. And, why don't we celebrate like St. Joan of Arc and companions, or, but also I think it just sort of like diffuses the intensity of that of everything that the film's really been driving to. I think it's quite unfortunate. I wish that it would just stay with her and with this death, because then the last shot of the film is like them like raising the drawbridge, and then like cut to the epilogue. It's like a really weird way to end
Do you think it has an anti-institutional effect?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I guess that's got to be it.
I was going to say, this is kind of the thorn that we haven't really touched on, which is there is an anti-clerical bent to the film. The film can be read either way. Like it reads very cleanly into an anti-clerical, authoritarian, anti-institutional reading. And then it also, as it has been, this film obviously is beloved by lots of Catholics for good reason. There's kind of a way to carve out a space to go like, well, yeah, like the parts of the institutional church did, persecute her unjustly.
Well, it only shows the trial. It doesn't show her in France,
right? Or it doesn't give you the context of like
but
this
it doesn't
particular
show her leading the French armies with the support of certain French clerics and the king, and
exactly, yeah. So it's definitely muddying the waters there into what seems to me to be a fairly simplistic anti.
I think the way Dreyer put his goal with the film was, he said it was a hymn to the soul's triumph over life, or something like that.
Oh my gosh. You gotta wonder, like, how do people come up with this stuff, man?
Yeah. Now, I think the way he ended up making this film was he was invited by some French institution to make a film, and was offered like a range of subject matters or something, maybe, and then he chose this. I can't remember the exact details, but there's one more thing about the reception of the film that I think is very interesting, because we've talked about how this film has this very radical, unusual visual style, and yet that it would be a great entry-level silent film. People in the film business and critics at the time thought that the film would not be accepted by ordinary people because of its radical visual approach. But there was this social democratic politician, I think in Denmark, who thought the film could reach ordinary people. And so he challenged this cinema owner to open his cinema to the masses. And this cinema owner let like 1,800 unemployed workers see the film for free at a matinee. And they distributed response cards, and they were overwhelmingly positive. But even after that, the film was still mainly distributed and marketed as an avant-garde piece for sophisticated viewers, which Dreyer very much objected to. And I thought that was worth mentioning just because, I mean, it's related to the purpose of this podcast, you know, of like getting people to watch this more like artistic film fare and sort of like not selling the people short, you know? I wanted to bring that up because I think it's just like, sure, not every, you know, Andrei Rublev is not as accessible as this film, but like we don't have to assume that people aren't capable of entering into works like this either.
Yeah. If I could throw like, I watched the film with two friends who hadn't seen it, both Catholic friends, and like they, you know, one was kind of more of a cinephile, and one definitely is not. Honestly, one of the most moving things I've encountered in sharing a film with somebody happened after the screening, when the friend who is definitely not a cinephile turned to me and basically said, "You've ruined movies for me. Like I'll never like
That's
unsee
awesome.
that, because that's the greatest thing I've ever seen."
That's
essentially,
awesome.
Paraphrasing what he said, but the film touched him so deeply on such a primal level. And to me, it just kind of, I mean, I've been trying to share films like this with friends for a very long time, especially, you know, within Catholic contexts. And, you know, it gets lonely. Not because people aren't willing to do it. Lots of people are. I find people are willing to do it, but you never know how a film's going to hit somebody, right? So when a film really lands deep into someone's heart, and you can really, it's almost like you get to experience it anew for the first time as well. And to me, I'm totally convinced of like this film, you know, can access anybody, you know, anybody who's willing to meet it just a little bit, just a bit open to it. You know, it has this kind of, it has that, I don't want to say primal, but like it just has that. It's a truly universal work, I guess, in that sense. I think it has what it takes to reach anybody.
True that.
Yeah, I'd go so far as to say that it's a nearly perfect work. I think it's one of the best that we've covered on this series so far. It's certainly jumped right up to among my very top favorites.
Nathan, I feel bad we never talked about the scene that you mentioned with the cool quote.
The
I
famous
forgot about
quote.
that.
Yeah, it was probably one of the most memorable lines, if not the most memorable line probably in the film, which is taken right from the trial transcript, is when they're trying to pin her down to, you know, did God promise you you're going to go to heaven when you die? You know, are you certain of your salvation? Are you certain you're in the state of grace? And there's this danger of like presumption or thinking that you can be absolutely certain. And so they're trying to trap her. And she says, after pausing for a long time, and they keep demanding that she answer the question, she says, what is the line exactly, Nathan?
I don't remember the exact word for word, but it's basically, if I am in the state, they say, are you in the state of grace? And there's this long pause. And then she says, if I am, then I pray he will, or she says, if I am not, then I pray he will grant me so. If I am, then I pray he will keep me there.
Yeah.
And the way that Dreyer, you know, that's a very simple statement, right? And you can imagine all sorts of treatments. And I'm sure there are other treatments existing in other later films that just, you know, handle it like a one line or whatever. But Dreyer just extends that moment. It's a very, again, very malleable moment. He's really milking it for all it's worth.
And the people are like leaning forward to see what she's going to say. And
and the thing is that it's entirely constructed through the editing. Like it's kind of similar to the Soviet school in that way, in that it's really about creating meaning and movement purely through editing, where, you know, someone says that line, they say that line. If they're on stage, they say that line, and we register the power of that. But in this case, it's really just creating this extended moment that is really outside of time in a sense, you know, to emphasize her victory over them. You know, it's this climactic, it's really kind of the climax of the verbal trials, you know, where there's just no way, they really think they've trapped her. It's similar to all the examples in the temple with the Pharisees and our Lord, you know, where they really think they got him this time. And Dreyer, I think, is drawing, a parallel to that, where he's just stretching that moment out. And I don't know, I just find it striking because it's purely from a formal analyzing it as form, it's coming from it's a very imposed thing. You know, it's actually, it's not a realistic thing, but he is trying to get to the reality of what it means, like what is happening in that moment. It's such an incredible thing, you know, that she said, that she was given the grace to say that. And I wanted to highlight it, I guess, because it's a good example of approaching sort of the reality of sanctity, and then also the reality of history, and like the things that provide the basis for making films from, you know, about saints. It's one approach, and a very effective one, to, you know, trying to get to the essence of what is going on. But of course, we're never going to fully exhaust that. Yeah. And it's not to say that should become the only way of doing it. It goes back to kind of our discussion in Therese about like showing sanctity. Right. You know, there's different ways of doing it, and a healthy cinema that, you know, flourishes under the church has room for both approaches. You know,
and one thing you can
so
say about for this film, which has come up in our questions about various saint films we've watched, is that Joan, however he may characterize the spiritual dynamic versus the personal spirituality versus the institution or whatever, it's clear that Joan's motive is all about God and loyalty to God and unity with Christ. And it's not just my conscience or, you know, that sort of abstracted stuff. It's definitely about Christ. And he draws those parallels. He puts her in the crown of straw and holding the arrow in her hand, and, you know, all these parallels to Christ's passion. And clearly that's what it's about. However, his understanding of the wider context of that, you know, may be lacking.
And I just want to throw in again, because we talked about it I keep referencing the Therese podcast. So if listeners, viewers, if you haven't watched or listened to that, I highly suggest it. You know, it dovetails with a lot of what we're talking about here. But basically we talked, what's that?
The Eucharist.
Exactly. Yeah. What we talked about there was how so many saint films don't have anything to do with the Eucharist. And here is one that, or they don't show how the Eucharist matters for the saint subject, for the person it's about. And here's a film that really astonishingly, because it puts it front and center in a way that is, I don't think I've seen any other film quite do it like this.
Her desire for the sacraments is a big part of her suffering.
Yeah.
I'm glad we did actually cover a lot of ground here, and for such a simple movie in a way, there was such a huge amount of things to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so
and really, we talked about it in a way that I don't think we could have talked about it when we first started this show. You know?
Oh, sure.
I think that like it's really evident to me like how much this practice of watching these films, you know, week after week is really beginning to like affect the way that I'm viewing these.
Same here.
And talking about them afterward.
Can I throw out I want to throw out just one maybe like challenge or suggestion to the audience, which is that, you know, if you feel inspired to watch Passion of Joan of Arc, by all means, go do that ASAP. But I would really encourage you not to stop there, because there is one of the fascinating things about especially French cinema is like there's a whole tradition of Joan of Arc films. Every generation of French filmmakers has to do their Joan of Arc film or several.
Bresson.
And I don't know, it's like Shakespeare kind of in English, you know, in culture, you know, where everyone has to do their version of it. It's an incredibly fruitful and very particularly 20th century thing. And yeah, Robert Bresson, great filmmaker, who I think, have we talked about him on this podcast yet?
No, not yet.
But surely we will at some point.
Yeah, he's not on the list, but we'll talk about him.
Yeah, amazing filmmaker. He did a trial of Joan of Arc in the 1960s, which is well worth seeing. Even very recently, there was a pair of films by filmmaker Bruno Dumont one about the childhood of Joan of Arc and one about the trial of Joan of Arc, and they're both based on the poetry or the plays by Charles Péguy, the French writer of the early 20th century.
And they're musicals, right? Or one of them is
fascinating films. The first one is Bruno Dumont's like
a heavy metal.
He's very strange and interesting filmmaker. He adapted the first of Péguy's plays about the childhood of Joan of Arc as a heavy metal musical, which sounds absurd, and it is absurd, but actually in sort of in the same way that Dreyer is really kind of reaching for the rafters in some of his stylistic choices here. It's an example of a filmmaker doing it in his own time and place. I'm not going to say it's the most successful way of doing it, but it's certainly distinctive, and you won't forget it. What I would call attention to is the film he made. It's kind of a sequel to that, which has nothing to do with musical. It's a completely different style, and it's a very striking portrayal of the Joan trial. But anyway, point being, there's lots of Joan of Arc movies out there. It's really, if you have time and energy, it's a lot of fun to kind of go through and compare them and see what they're all doing differently.
Okie dokie. Everybody, thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. And if you liked this episode, please share. We'd like to grow our viewer/listener base for Criteria and get more people watching these great films. All right. Thanks, guys.